Hi, everyone. Today we're going to look at the readings from Thomas Nagel and Peter Singer. So this starts the last section of our course on value theory. So value theory is the branch of philosophy that studies questions of value. So questions of morality. So for example, what's the difference between right and wrong? What makes certain actions permissible? Um, Questions of beauty. So what makes something beautiful or ugly? Are these standards objective or something else? We're mostly going to be focused on ethics um, and as the sort of sub-branch of value theory. And for today's reading, I'm going to focus, today's lecture, focus mostly on the Singer paper. So the Nagel chapters gives us some background, general background of how philosophers understand value theory in general and ethics in particular. Um, so we can start off with looking at Singer's paper. Um, and it's a relatively simple argument that he offers us, and he thinks it's a good argument. Um, it's up to us to decide whether that's true or not. So remember, we can evaluate philosophical arguments for soundness. Two questions there. Number one, is the logic of the argument valid? So it's a deductive argument. So the question is, does the conclusion logically follow from the premises? And in a valid argument, that means if the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be as well. There's no other way. And then secondly, are the premises themselves true? So I'll try and lay out the argument. But what's interesting about this is, despite the fact that it's a relatively simple argument, it leads to a conclusion that is pretty surprising, and if Singer is right, requires us to change our lives in some pretty drastic ways. So just some background. It's just a fact about our world that every day many people die from causes that are in principle easy to prevent. So some things are not easy to prevent, right? So we don't have cures for various cancers or other medical problems, and lots of people die from that. That's not an easy problem to solve, right? But some problems or some deaths are not like that. So every day, I'm not sure what it is at the moment, but it's in the thousands. Every day, thousands of people die from access to clean water, sufficient food, and also die from diseases and complications that arise from various diseases, which we do know how to treat and cure in many cases. So as Singer points out, the main cause of this, or the main characteristic of such cases, is poverty, right? So many people in the world live in very deep poverty, and there are different ways of defining what that is. Different governments have different standards for what counts as poverty, but by any measure I've ever heard, it's in the hundreds of millions, right, across the world. So it's possible, right, that if resources were redistributed in various ways, it's possible that if we wanted to, we could greatly reduce those deaths and also the suffering, which doesn't always lead to death. And we'll spell this out in a bit more detail, but these are going to form the basic premises of Singer's argument. The conclusion of his argument is that we, right, and who's we? It's going to be people who are relatively well off in the world, so the rich and rich countries, so like the United States, for example. Singer believes that we morally ought to prevent suffering and death due to poverty in the world. And by prevent, he doesn't mean 100%. Maybe it's not possible to do that, but we could, if we wanted to, prevent a lot of it. It would just maybe mean less money for um, for professional sports or something like that, or less money for consumer electronics, or maybe it would mean higher taxes on the rich or something like that. But if we did that, we could raise a lot of money and distribute resources like clean water and basic medicine to people who would otherwise suffer and die from that in the world. Um, so, so far, we haven't seen a moral argument. We've just seen a rehearsal of some facts about the world. Many people do die from poverty, and that if we wanted to, we could put a pretty serious dent in that. The question is, do we have any moral obligation to do so? And I think most people think, well, no, it would be charitable if we um, if we gave up some of our wealth in the rich countries to fund reductions in poverty elsewhere in the world, right? It would be praiseworthy if we did that. It would be nice, but it's not our duty to do so. So here, there's a distinction between what your duty or your obligation is on the one hand, from what would be nice of you to do, right, but is not required. So we can call that being charitable, right? So many of us think donating the money to poverty relief or some other good cause, that's charitable, right? Admirable, that's nice to do. But if you choose not to do it, you're not guilty of wrongdoing. You haven't done anything wrong. So I think that's the common sense view that a lot of people hold. And Singer thinks that that view is wrong. So he thinks that no, we do have an obligation to to donate or otherwise redistribute our wealth in a way that would reduce poverty in the world. It's not just something that would be nice of us to do; it's something that we're required to do. And if we don't do it, then we're guilty of some pretty serious wrongdoing. In a real sense, he believes we're responsible for the deaths of millions of people every year in the world who, through no fault of their own, die from these causes that we could prevent. Um, so, so that's Singer's conclusion, right? Roughly, we ought to do a lot more to prevent suffering and death in the world due to poverty. Um, and so far, he hasn't given you any reasons to agree with that, right? You might, well, that's just your opinion. Why should I accept it? We're going to look at the reasons he gives for why he thinks that we should accept it. And then it's up to you to try and assess the argument and honestly decide whether he's right. If you can find a real flaw in the argument, then might let you off the hook. But if you can't, right? If his reasoning is valid and if his premises are all true, you have a sound argument, then there's no way to escape the conclusion that we ought to do a lot more. And what exactly we should do is an open question, but he'll at least have you to the point where you say, yeah, we should do a lot more to prevent the suffering in the world. So we'll look at his argument here in a second. But the sort of image he uses, right, this case that he imagines of a drowning child is supposed to provide a kind of analogy, right? So you remember from the reading, Singer says, well, imagine that you're walking by a shallow pond and you see a child who's drowning, right, so struggling, and assume that there's nobody else around. So you have a choice. You either jump into the pond, save the child, or you do nothing and let the child drown. So most people, I think everyone that I've ever asked, says that, well, of course, in that case, you have an obligation to jump into the pond and save the child, even if it ruins your fancy shoes or your clothes or something, right? So it does come at a cost to you. You've lost out on the value of those shoes. So it's I don't know how much they cost, like $20 or $100, whatever people spend. Say they're fancy shoes, so 120. I don't know. So that's a real cost. That's bad, but it's a very small price to pay to save a life, right? And I think everyone, just about everyone, agrees that, yeah, of course you ought to save the child's life. And Singer says, well, now imagine that same situation, but there are other people standing by as well. So you're not the only one. Say there's 5 other people, and they're all just watching, right? Singer asks, does that let you off the hook? Can you say, well, I don't have to save the child because someone else should do it? And Singer thinks, well, no, of course not, right? Just because other people aren't doing what they should be doing doesn't change the fact that you ought to save the child, right? Um, we should all do what we can to help, but if some people choose not to, then it's on the rest of us to do what we can. Um, so Singer thinks, though, if you agree with him on a case like that, which, like I said, just about everyone does, then he thinks, by analogy, you should have the same judgment when it comes to people suffering due to death and poverty. Suffering and dying due to poverty. And the reasoning, as we're going to see in a second, is pretty much the same. Namely that, well, these people are having something bad happen to them, very bad, through no fault of their own, right? Just like the child, innocent person in danger. You can, right? You have the power, the ability to do something to stop it. And Singer thinks, well, if that's the case, then we ought to. We have an obligation to do something to help, right? So we don't say, if you save the child, oh, that's nice of you, right? That's very charitable, right? You get a medal. But if you choose not to, it's, we can't blame you. It's, you didn't want to get your shoes ruined. We wouldn't respond that way, right? We'd judge that person pretty harshly. We'd say, no, you could have done something and you chose not to. And that's shameful, right? All right, so Singer takes this example, right? This case that he imagines, and it's not outlandish, right? Things like this do happen, right? People do save drowning children at beaches and things like that. Other cases that are similar. And he takes this case and he wants to understand, well, what's the sort of philosophical reasoning behind this? Why is it the case that you have a duty to save the child? And this is the argument that he gives. So, and remember, the order of the premises in an argument doesn't matter. This might be slightly out of order of the way Singer puts it, but it doesn't matter as long as we have all the premises, we get the conclusion. So one of the premises is going to be that suffering and death due to poverty are bad. So just like an innocent child drowning and dying from that is a bad thing, it's a bad thing that children, and many of them are children, but adults too, die as a result of poverty, right, due to lack of food or water or medicine. So the first premise is just the statement, well, that's a bad thing when it happens. And it's hard to find anyone who would disagree with that, right? No one thinks it's a good thing that innocent people die, right? So that's a pretty uncontroversial premise, Singer states, right? Suffering and death due to poverty are bad. Premise 2 is going to be now our ethical or moral principle. And this is the principle that Singer puts forward. It states, if we can prevent something bad from happening at minimal cost to ourselves, then we have a moral obligation to prevent that bad thing from happening. So I'll say it again. If we can prevent something bad from happening, then we ought to prevent it, assuming that the cost of doing so is minimal. That sort of little condition that we have an obligation to prevent bad things from happening, provided that the cost is relatively minimal, or as Singer puts it, without sacrificing something else of comparable moral importance. What he means is that if you find yourself in a situation where something bad is happening, but the only way to stop it is to do something that is itself deeply immoral, right? That, say, does more harm than good, that harms the innocent in some significant way, then Singer's principle doesn't apply, right? So if I don't have any money to donate because I myself am in poverty, then I don't have an obligation to donate what little I have on Singer's view, right? Because that will just end up causing harm to, say, my own children or something. So that's why he has that. But Premise 2, the short version is just, if we can prevent something bad from happening, then we ought to prevent it, with the little proviso, right? The little condition, that provided that we don't sacrifice something of moral importance in doing so. All right, so we got premise 1, suffering and death due to poverty are bad. Premise 2, if we can prevent something bad from happening, then we ought to do so. Premise 3, which is going to be the last premise, states the following. Namely, we can prevent suffering and death due to poverty. So that can, Singer's saying, it is possible. If we wanted to, we could do it, right? So there's a lot of resources, a lot of wealth in the world that goes to things that people either hoard it or spend it on things that aren't that valuable, right? Maybe it creates some jobs or something in the process, but Singer thinks, if we wanted to, we could invest as a world, right? The rich countries could invest in eradicating poverty or getting close to it. So I think that's the way to understand it. I mentioned before when he says we can prevent, I don't think he means that you can guarantee that there will never be a single case of poverty ever again in the world. The spirit of it is more to say that, no, we can basically eliminate it. We can prevent much of it, or almost all of it, if we wanted to. So let's take these three premises together. Number 1, suffering and death due to poverty are bad. Number 2, if we can prevent something bad from happening, then we ought to do so. And premise 3, we can, in fact, prevent suffering and death due to poverty. If you accept all of those premises, then his conclusion logically follows. It's a valid argument. So the conclusion being that we ought to prevent suffering and death due to poverty. So the way to put this a little less formally is to say that, well, suffering and death from poverty are bad. We could do a lot to reduce it or stop it. And we have a moral obligation to stop bad things from happening when we can. So there's no way to escape the conclusion that we ought to do a lot more to reduce suffering and death due to poverty in our world. And Singer thinks it's a moral obligation, right? It's something that we have to do, the same way that you're supposed to keep your promises that you make normally. You're not supposed to violate people's rights. You're supposed to be respectful towards people, right? Don't tell lies, I guess, if you think that one's a moral principle. Things like this, right? Where you can't just say, oh, it's nice if you do it, but you don't have to. No, there are some things that we have to do, that it's wrong if we don't do them. Singer thinks, well, this is a case of that. Just as we have an obligation to save the drowning child, by really the same logic, we have an obligation to help those suffering from poverty. So the premises that Singer offers, the three of them seem to be pretty uncontroversial. So despite that, right, you begin with some basic ideas, some premises that, on the face of it seem pretty reasonable and probably a lot of people would agree with. Singer puts them together to show, though, that it has this surprising implication, right? That most of us, right, who have disposable income, we could donate that money to reputable aid organizations that do a lot of good work. And in most cases, we choose not to, right? Or we choose to give very little, relatively speaking, right? You might make a nice donation and feel good about yourself, but Singer thinks it's not nearly enough. So I don't know if he's right, but it's not easy for me to see where he's wrong in the argument, right? That would be the challenging part. So that's something that we'll have to think about. We can't just say, and this is the maybe, I guess, one of the good things about philosophy is that Singer's not just spouting off here. He's not just giving you his opinion, right? He's not just saying, I think we should stop poverty. You might say, well, that's nice. Why should I believe that? Why should I agree? And he says, well, here's why. And he gives you a rational argument that we can't just reject because we don't like it. We have a a kind of a rational obligation, you might say, if we're going to take logic seriously, to look at the argument and say, hey, if I don't agree with the conclusion, then where's the argument go wrong? Why shouldn't I follow what Singer says I should do? Now, maybe you can come up with something. But if we just say we don't like what he says, that's not really a good reason to reject him, right? So just a few things. So various objections have been raised to Singer's argument. Some of them might work. It's not for me to say that, whether they do or not. But one that gets raised a lot is, and this would amount to challenging the third premise. I think it was the third one I said, right? The claim that we can prevent suffering and death due to poverty. Some people say, well, maybe that's not actually possible, right? Because of corruption, we don't know where our money is going, things like that. Singer's done a lot of work. So this is a relatively famous paper that he wrote back in the 70s that you read, but he's written a lot on this topic since then, and full-length books and that kind of thing. And since he wrote that in the 70s, there are organizations now that make it their job to vet different charities and aid organizations, and actually try and rate them based on how effective they are. So one of them is called GiveWell, so givewell.org, and they rate, I think they actually rank even, different organizations and how much good they do. And at the top of their list, I assume it's still the case, haven't looked in recent years, but in the past at the top of their list was an organization that fights malaria. So that's a major cause of suffering and death in regions with a lot of poverty in the world. And you can greatly reduce the risk of malaria through some relatively cheap measures. So one being the use of mosquito nets. So that's pretty cheap to produce those and to ship them and to get them to the places they need to be. Instead of expensive medical research, it's just a way to reduce the risk of contracting diseases from mosquitoes. And GiveWell finds, right, based on their sort of following all the information available about how the money gets used, what the organizations do, right, and trying to estimate how many lives actually get saved. They find that some charities are thousands of times more effective than others, right? So Singer argues with those sorts of resources today, which we have access to because of the got the internet, things like that. Because of things like that, we don't really have the excuse of saying like, well, who knows where the money's going, right? I'm worried about corruption, so I'm not going to donate. Singer says, well, no, you just got to do your research, and it doesn't take that much work. But even if it did take some work, he would say have an obligation to do that, right? And yeah, sure, there are some organizations that are shady, right, and downright corrupt. You don't want to donate to those. Donate to the good ones, but the good ones do exist, right? So again, okay, we can see a pretty basic ethical principle. If we can prevent something bad from happening, then we ought to do it. Why should we believe that? Well, because of cases like the drowning child, right? Something bad is happening, we can prevent it, so we ought to. Singer just applies that at a larger scale, right? And he thinks, well, most of us should change our lives pretty drastically. Okay, so I'll leave it there, focused mostly on the Singer reading. That's the main thing you want to know for this week. If you have access to the Nagel book, also read those chapters. But the most important bit is the Singer argument. So, all right, I'll stop there and talk to you next week.